Richard Nixon.
Hey, welcome to you, our viewers around the world, and to you, President Nixon. First question, Saddam Hussein, should he be tried for war crimes?
Yes, he should be tried for war crimes if it's possible to get him to trial. I think what we have to realize here is that this man is an evil man. He's an international criminal. He's been compared with Hitler, but let's just understand that he, like Hitler, has killed a lot of people outside his country, but he's also killed a lot of people inside his country and is continuing to do so. Under the circumstances, any way to get him out of Iraq and then to get him tried for those crimes, I think should be pulled off if it possibly can be done.
When you say anyway, are you also alluding to what you told Mike Wallace in 60 Minutes last night, that if the CIA could conduct a hit, it should do it?
What I was referring to in my talk with Mike Wallace was the fact that several years ago, as you will recall, in about 1974, there was an investigation of the CIA, and it was revealed that there had been some claims that the CIA had planned to assassinate Castro. They didn't pull it off, and there's no evidence that the CIA ever did pull off an assassination. What I was referring to was very simply this, that if it were possible to remove this man from power by some method like that, I would be for it. And when people say, but my goodness, isn't assassination the wrong thing to do? Let me say the world would have been a lot better off if somebody had assassinated Hitler before he killed all the people he killed.
So if Saddam Hussein could become the target of a hit, you would not lose any sleep?
I would lose a bit, and I noticed that Jim Baker has indicated as much, and President Bush as well, that they're not going to have any regrets when he leaves the scene. Now, I don't know that they're referring to leaving the scene physically. The main thing is to get him out of Iraq. He's going to continue to be a menace to his own people, which is a terrible thing, but also to people outside, because within 4 or 5 years, with his oil and his other capabilities, he will again threaten his neighbors, in my opinion.
While you were 37th President of the United States, did you ever order a contract on anyone?
No. In fact, that's all been exaggerated in terms of all the presidents. The incident that was referred to in the famous church committee hearings involved as I've indicated before, the possibility of taking out Castro. And they had poison plots, a lot of silly things, but none of them were ever really approved by the Kennedy administration. I remember none under the Eisenhower administration, and certainly there were none under our administration, none at all.
Did you ever want, in your heart, in your mind, to have someone wiped out?
I always preferred to have them wiped out politically rather than physically. I think one of the problems when you do it physically is that you create a martyr complex. I think when you can do it politically, it's a much better way to do it. And also, let's face it, I mean, I don't want to sound like a soft head here, but I just don't like the idea of killing people. But here you've got to balance this man, Saddam Hussein, his life, against the lives of tens of thousands of people that we've seen on your programs and others, that he is now massacring, starving to death. Some of them are freezing to death. This man is a menace, and he's got to be taken out one way or another, in my opinion.
What about martyrdom for Saddam, though?
I doubt if it will work in his case. I don't think it's going to work because of what he's done previously. I think he's broken his pick. He broke his pick by invading a fellow Arab state or a Muslim state, Kuwait. And then after all of the talk, you were out there and reported on it, the blowing heart about what he was going to do and all that sort of thing, his armies collapsed within a matter of 3 days. And there is nothing in the Arab world that is more discrediting than to fail, and to fail miserably. He's a failure. I don't think that he has the possibilities of martyrdom that he did have, however, before he lost that Gulf War.
President Bush, a couple times in the run-up to and during the prosecution of the war, he indicated that he would love to see the Iraqi people solve the problem of Saddam Hussein. And then after the war, up to the very second while we speak here on CNN, there's the sight of the Kurds trying to flee the hammer of Saddam Hussein. Did you wince when you began to see what was happening to the rebels not just the Shiites, but certainly the Kurds, because we're thinking about them now. So many are dying. Did you feel that George went too far in encouraging people in your own mind, and then this aftermath?
Well, as far as President Bush was concerned, I don't think that he in his own mind went too far.
Who went too far?
I think what he felt was that the people of Iraq, the leadership, particularly the military leadership, would see that this man was one that they should really retire from the position of leadership. On the other hand, it's understandable that the Kurds and, frankly, the Shiites as well might take a signal, that kind of a statement from the president, and say, well, that gives us a green light. If we rebel, maybe we'll have support. President Bush did not intend that, I'm sure of that, and it is certainly must sadden him, as he's indicated, that we have had these terrible massacres as a result of the rebellion which Saddam Hussein has been putting down with such terrible ferocity.
But many Kurds feel they've been stabbed in the back.
They do. Just as I remember so well the Hungarians. I was in Budapest, or just outside of Budapest, I should say, on the Austrian border in 1956. And there, President Eisenhower had not made a statement with regard to liberating the Hungarians from Soviet control. But Radio Free Europe had a broadcast supporting the idea of liberation. As a result, Soviet tanks mowed down the Hungarians who rebelled. President Eisenhower took a lot of heat for not doing something about it. It was a very tough decision for him. He wanted to do something about it. I think it was a very tough decision for George Bush. He wanted to do something about it. But what were his choices? To start the war over again? To have thousands of American lives risked and lost in order to save the Kurds, who, as you know, are people without a country, not only in Iraq, but in Turkey, Iran, and other places in the world. It's one of the great tragedies of history. But I must say I sympathize with the Kurds, but I think instead of blaming George Bush, let's blame the real criminal, and the real criminal is Saddam Hussein.
Was it a mistake for President Bush to have given his emotions and feelings such a high profile, though?
Bernie, many of the commentators, I think, have indicated it was a mistake. I happen to, let me say that I was in the Soviet Union at the time some of this was happening. I didn't consider it a mistake then, because I understood him to be saying, in effect, to the responsible people in Iraq, and there are responsible people in a country of 18 million people, to say, look, this man is bringing us down to disaster, so remove him. I think that's what I thought he intended. I frankly was surprised that as a result of what he said, the Kurds rebelled. But that's the way it is sorted out, and he has to take, of course, a lot of heat for it. But now I think he's doing the right thing. He's taking the lead on humanitarian aid. And incidentally on that, I think the Japanese and the Germans ought to put up a lot more money for that humanitarian aid.
How much more?
They should about triple the amount that they've done so far.
Both Germany and Japan?
Germany and Japan. Particularly the Japanese, the Germans perhaps a bit less, because they have to put so much out in order to bail out East Germany, which they've inherited. But since neither of them contributed, except some financial assistance to the Gulf War, I think this is a time for these two economic superpowers to bear some of this burden that the United States is bearing and the other UN nations.
Do I hear some anger in your voice?
No, it's not anger. It's simply frustration. Frustration in the sense that when we talk about this new world order, it isn't enough for people to say, here's the great big United States. We're the richest country in the world. We're the strongest country in the world. We're the only complete superpower. What's the United States going to do? My answer is, we'll do our part. But let the other economic superpowers, like the Germans, like the Japanese, do their share too. We don't ask them to take over, but they should do more and make up for what they cannot contribute in the way of military power.
When we come back, we're going to talk about the specter of President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union due to land in Tokyo in a matter of hours, and Boris Yeltsin on his first trip to Strasbourg in France, making statements about his Russian Republic.
The European auto rally, the historic spawning ground for SARS. But now there's a new Saab, powered by the largest engine Saab ever built. But it's also highly civilized and incredibly spacious. Because passionate drivers don't just run races. Sometimes they run errands. The 9000S. We don't make compromises. We make Saabs.
Lease a 1991 Saab 900 for only $299 a month. See your local Saab dealer today.
Some people are still wondering if Pip Printing does multicolor printing. The answer is yes, we do a little. Enough to fill this little football field every day. Color printing. One more reason Pip Printing's the biggest business printer in the world.
When you're the owner, you've got to give a lot more.
Avis is the only major rent-a-car company owned by its employees, so they'll give you more than low rates. You get free unlimited mileage, too. Avis, we're trying harder than ever.
Mikhail Gorbachev, in a matter of hours, will be touching down in Tokyo. It'll be the first time in history that a Soviet leader will have gone to Japan. Before we get to that, Newsweek magazine says that the KGB has sent word out to all its agents worldwide, warning them that civil war is a possibility in the Soviet Union.
I can see the KGB doing that. On the other hand, I do not think that civil war is going to happen. It's a possibility. I don't think it's a probability. And the reason is that Gorbachev is not going to want to engage in repressive actions at a time he needs help from the West. He doesn't want to risk that. And the other reason is that Yeltsin, who is his only competitor, does not want to run the risk of civil war. Look, they've come to the brink several times. And you realize that in the Russian Republic, as distinguished from Lithuania and Georgia, there have been no deaths as yet.
But what if Gorbachev really needs to crack heads? What if the hardliners, the extreme right-wingers say, look, it's either you or them?
It's going to be a very tough decision for him. But if he then goes with the reactionaries, the hardliners, as you call them, he may save his power, but he'll lose his place in history. And I think this man, who just a year ago, we must remember, was the most popular statesman in the world, this man who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, this man who is Time Magazine's Man of the Decade, this man is going to think a long time before he engages in that kind of repression. In fact, I've heard some of his supporters describe him as being a brutal wimp. They think he's too weak.
But the Soviet people cannot nibble off the Nobel Peace Prize.
They certainly can't. And let me tell you, the victories that he has in foreign policy don't help him at all at home. When people have to stand in line, not just for food and other things, but even an hour and a half for cigarettes, believe me, they aren't satisfied with the fact that their leader is tipping glasses with the leaders of the world, wherever it is, whether in Tokyo or in Washington, D.C.
Why do leaders do that? I remember when you were having domestic problems, in the final months of your administration, you went off to the Soviet Union. Why is this man going to Tokyo when he has fires burning? He can practically smell the smoke coming from Moscow.
I believe that he's going there because he needs a new front. Look, he has lost Eastern Europe. It wasn't a question of his wanting to give up Eastern Europe. It went far beyond what he expected, but he has lost Eastern Europe. And so he's looking the other way. And there sits Tokyo. Here sits Japan, an economic superpower. It has everything that he needs, and he has everything they need, the natural resources. If he can make some sort of an agreement with the Japanese, whereby he could get some help economically from the Japanese, it would be of enormous assistance to him. And the outline of a deal is this: as you know, the Soviet Union still controls 4 Japanese islands based on what happened in World War II. If they would be willing, the Soviet Union, to give up 4 of those islands, or at least 2 of those islands, which is the latest ploy I heard about when I was in Moscow, that might be the makings of a deal. And I can see then that Gorbachev would not be as dependent upon the West as he is now for the aid that he needs. He could turn to the Japanese. We could see a new axis, an axis between the Soviet Union, Japan, and possibly even Germany.
Chinese won't sit still for that.
The Chinese would not like it, but there isn't a great deal that the Chinese could do about it, And I must say, though, that looking to the future, you put your finger on the reason why the United States has got to keep forces in Japan. Let's look at Japan. People say, bring the boys home. They're rich enough that they defend themselves. But if Japan, which is an economic superpower, sees the Soviet Union, which is a nuclear superpower on one side, they see the Chinese who will have 1,500 strategic nuclear weapons within about 5 years on another side, what's Japan going to do? With us gone, they either have to rearm or make a deal with one of the others. And that's not good for us, it's not good for Japan, and it's certainly going to be disastrous for the cause of peace in the Pacific.
Let's stay in that part of the world for a moment. First, China. Former President Carter just yesterday gave a very tough speech to Beijing's diplomatic school, in effect telling the Chinese government, look, free the people you have in prison, the people who are guilty of nonviolent acts in behalf of democracy, and the people who spoke out for religious freedom. Is that kind of statement from a world leader such as Mr. Carter, does it have an impact on the Chinese? You were there. You made the great breakthrough.
I've been there, and of course, as you know, I was back a year ago when I spoke very strongly to the Chinese as a friend, an old friend.
They didn't like it.
They didn't like it, but I'm a friend and I'm also old, so they like both of those things. In any event, I can remember so well that I talked to them about the need for them to express some contrite attitudes with regard to what had happened in the massacre at Tiananmen Square, and also to release some of the people that they had. Let me say that I see no objection to President Carter raising that issue. On the other hand, let us understand this. The Chinese do not have at the present time the capability to become a democracy. They don't have the people that can run it. Are you going to have the president of the student body of Beijing University run a country of 1.2 billion people?
Okay, your point is well taken. Another area. The Soviets have told the North Koreans they will stop assisting them in building nuclear power plants because United States intelligence has learned that the North Koreans are about to use a plant to help separate plutonium, which, as we know, goes into nuclear weapons. North Korea, nuclear threat?
Yes, it could be a very dangerous one. And here, Bernie, we come to an area of very great promise for the American-Soviet relationships. We talk about all the differences we have. But one place where we have a common interest is to stop the nuclear weapons being sent all over the world. Non-proliferation, not only of nuclear weapons, but of missiles of all sorts. And if the United States and the Soviet Union, the two nuclear superpowers, can work together to stop this kind of getting these weapons in the hands of madmen, which basically the North Koreans are. I mean, you think Saddam Hussein is crazy? Just take a look at the present leader of North Korea.
Well, that's
He's no
precisely,
bargain either.
That's precisely why I brought up the question. We're going to have to pause, but I want to come back to North Korea before we move on to Boris Yeltsin. Back with former President Nixon in just a moment. Briefly, back to North Korea. The North Koreans will not allow anyone to inspect their nuclear facilities. North Korea, a threat to the Pacific Basin?
No question about it. And that's another reason why we have to keep forces in South Korea. The South Koreans are rich enough to defend themselves, but the Americans being there is a threat that the North Koreans have to deal with. The fact that we're there is a deterrent to the North Koreans.
I have a horrible question to put to you, because horrible in the sense it raises a specter. But if you had to guess, based on your global knowledge, which two countries are most likely to engage in a nuclear exchange? In other words, nuclear war.
Well, first, the two that will not engage in a nuclear war are the United States and the Soviet Union. We both are nuclear superpowers. We know what those weapons can do. We know that for us to have a nuclear war would be mutual suicide. So we begin by eliminating those. I would say, looking around the world, North Korea would worry me first because they are so irresponsible. And the other area that concerns me considerably is South Asia. I'm talking about India and Pakistan. I'm not saying which would start it. Both have nuclear capabilities. They haven't. India has already exploded an atomic device. Perhaps Pakistan will be able to soon. I would say there's nothing more important in U.S.-Soviet relations, therefore, than to work together, to cooperate, to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. That should be our great goal at this time when we're building a new world order.
On to Boris Yeltsin, speaking about a new world order in the Soviet Union. He said in Strasbourg, France, that the Republic of Russia should have the authority to conduct its own foreign and domestic policies. He's speaking in France while his president is en route to Japan. What's going on?
Well, what is going on here is that Yeltsin is, despite what he said there, a realist. He knows that at the present time that Gorbachev has to speak for the Soviet Union because Gorbachev has the KGB, he has the military-industrial complex, and he has the Communist Party. He's got the power. On the other hand, once Yeltsin is elected, which Gorbachev has never happened to him, once he is elected as a leader of Russia, which is, of course, the most important of the republics, he will have enormous power. Whether or not he would then insist that he take over the nuclear programs, I think is very, very debatable. I would doubt it. But let me say this. To Boris Yeltsin's credit, he would do something that Gorbachev would not. He would give immediate independence to all the Baltic countries. He would withdraw all Soviet aid to Cuba, to Afghanistan, and to Angola. Yeltsin is not one who wants to expand the Soviet Union's power over the world. He wants to contract it. He wants to concentrate on making life better in the Soviet Union rather than keeping the Soviet empire intact.
Life in the United States, politics, Campaign 92, George Bush going for a second term. George McGovern is talking about running again. How does that grab you?
Well, it's very courageous. Courageous to run against the champ since nobody else is willing to take him on. I think that George McGovern is a very sincere man, but he sincerely believes in what I think are the wrong things on occasion.
Richard Nixon, what Democrat, in your judgment, would give George Bush the toughest run?
Cuomo, without question. I know that he's unpopular in this state in which we're appearing at the present time due to the fact that all governors are unpopular because they've got huge budget deficits. But he's articulate, he's eloquent, he also gives a sense of vision and mission. He would be very good in debate. The question is whether he can get New York State in good enough shape that he would be able to go from there and run nationally. But if he runs, he would give George Bush a good race, but Bush will win unless, and this is a huge unless, there's a recession. If there's a recession, it'll be very close, but Bush will still win.
Dan Quayle, stay on the ticket?
With the way the situation is working for George Bush at the present time, 78% approval in the polls, he's not going to change his vice presidential nominee.
Do you have any qualms about Dan Quayle?
No, not about Dan Quayle, the man. Dan Quayle came from my mother state, Indiana.
What about Dan Quayle, the vice president?
Dan Quayle, as vice president, as I've watched him, has done a very credible job. I mean, he's done everything that the president has asked him to do. He has not made any big boo-boos.
Is he getting a bum rap?
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, you know, I'm supposed to be a media basher, and I'm not going to bash the media because it isn't just from them, it's from others as well. Dan Quayle got off to a bad start as being a lightweight. The problem about whether or not he had served in the National Guard appropriately or not during the Vietnam War. But Dan Quayle, I think, has the potential to develop the strength, which will mean that when 1992 runs around, he will not be a liability so that the president would think he'd have to dump him. I do not see him being dumped, although there will be a great effort to do so, not because of 92, but because of who's going to be number one in 96.
George Bush, we only have a minute, President Nixon. George Bush, obviously strong on foreign policy. A lot of people say weak domestically. What should be the number one domestic priority?
The number one domestic priority at the present time, I think, should be the economy in the broadest sense. But beyond that, I would say that he used to talk about, and he still does, about being the education president. In the broadest sense, that is the greatest need. Let me say, whatever you want to say about the Soviet Union, they're moving ahead well in education. But and I think the greatest need in this country for all classes of our people is an enormous improvement in education, and I'd put more money into it. I'd put more emphasis on it at the expense of other things.
We're really going to squeeze these seconds very quickly. What's wrong with the Democrats?
The fact that the Democrats do not have an issue. I mean, what are they going to run against? They can't run against foreign policy. They lost on that. It's a liability for them to raise foreign policy. And as far as domestic policy is concerned, it isn't going to help them because they can only win when there's money to spend. There's no money to spend. So under the circumstances, the fact that there's no money to spend means that they've got to be for balanced budgets and things like that. Show me a Democratic candidate that has ever won winning on balancing the budget.
Last question, most important question. How is Mrs. Nixon?
You know, she is, and I appreciate the question because she's a quite remarkable person. We're moving, we're moving from the house that you have visited and celebrated. We're moving to an apartment, and she's been working in that apartment while I was in Moscow. I always managed to be away when we're moving. And any woman of 79 years of age that can conduct the moving of a household from one place to another has got to be very strong, despite the fact that she's had 2 strokes. She is a remarkably strong woman.
Moving, especially with all the things you have. Mr. President, always a pleasure. We thank you for joining us here on CNN.
Thank you. It's always good to be with you.